In this week's ESO vlog, we take a look at the Nemesis Vampire PvP build. Welcome everybody to my PvP Nightblade Vampire Nemesis build. I call it that because its function is to annoy, frustrate, counter, and just plain troll your opponent into burning his stamina on your terms until he gets caught into something he can't get out of. For those of you that played it, this is very much like an old school Warcraft Outlast build. So without further ado, let's break down the ESO equivalent of an arena troll. As always, I like to start with race, and if you're talking vampire, then you are talking Dunmer. Why? Well, of course, vampires suffer a massive weakness to fire-based damage. In PvP, everybody uses fire, so this really can't be ignored, which is exactly why I use the word massive in the first place. The Dunmer racial passive will offset the weakness to fire that vampires suffer. This is also a Magicka-based build, and Dunmer Magicka passives are amongst the best in the game. However, you may have some reason why Dunmer is not an option. Perhaps you just don't want to play a character with skin that dark. There are some options, but there are three things we have to keep in mind. Number one, you are a bigot. Number two, you will have to find a piece of gear with some flame resistance on it to offset the vampire fire weakness. Number three, this is a Magicka-based build, which will point towards either the Altmer or Breton. The spell rotations involved in this build do not have spell cost reductions that will stack with the Breton racial. Therefore, mathematically speaking, the Altmer racials outweigh the Breton racials. So Dunmer number one, Altmer number two, Breton number three. Moving on to attributes. Unfortunately, the ESO head character builder doesn't have something I can show for attributes, but it's fairly simple. Until they change the scaling, all 49 attribute points should go into health. The statistics that are associated with Magicka and stamina can be put well past their soft caps in more efficient ways than by assigning those attributes points. So all points go into the health attribute. This is a Magicka-based build, so armor-wise, we're going to use 7 pieces of light armor. That just makes sense. Our priority is maximum Magicka pool, and then second will be Magicka recovery. So Mundus Stone is going to be the mage, and you are going to want to get traits and enchants that follow that priority. Magicka pool number 1, Magicka regeneration number 2. All right, enough of that nerd math nonsense. I apologize. Let's get to the part where we troll some poor son of a bitch, which brings us to our PvP bar number 1 featuring the Restoration Staff. Now, I've chosen the Restoration Staff because unlike the Destruction Staff, you don't have to use abilities from its skill line in order to benefit from its passives. Remember, we are a vampire now, and we have a lot of extra skills available to us, and nothing from the Destruction Staff is mandatory, so we're better off enjoying the Restoration Staff passives. These passives include improved healing efficiency and overall damage output increase. Now, unless you get totally surprised and jumped and opened up on with a stun, you're going to start the fight with Crippling Grasp. Now, this reduces his movement speed and increases yours, which means you can now kite him without the use of any stamina, and it lasts 8 seconds. Shortly after you do that, and by the way, all of these abilities on this bar are insta-cast. So once you've got that up on him, you then throw Degeneration, which is a glorified health siphoning dot. All right? So now he's got 2 dots on him. The first one, Crippling Grasp, does a decent amount of damage. The second one is passively healing you. Remember our Restoration Staff, so that is tacking on a little bit to that. And you simply kite your target, pepper them with the Restoration Staff, which will also heal you, until he determines it's in his best interest to either burn Magicka or stamina to close the gap. Let's just say if he burns stamina, like he uses sprint or something like that to close the gap, this fight is probably half over because then he will not be able to get out of stun effects. But let's assume he's smart and he starts wearing down his Magicka pool first. Well, as soon as you get there, you have an insta-cast stun. So he uses the Death Knight, let's say Fiery Grip, whatever, pulls you right to him. Boom, you throw a stun right in his face before he gets to unload on your face. He, of course, is going to click out of that, burning a chunk of his stamina. All right? Now, you're sitting here thinking, okay, he just clicked out. When he burned that stamina, he bought himself, I believe it's 4 seconds of control and vulnerability. This does not apply, though, that 4 seconds, to the immobilization effect. And it doesn't matter because you're naturally running faster than him anyway because that debuff is still there. You pop your Poison Mist, which without burning any of your stamina gives you now a 4-second invulnerability to the control effects. You then reopen up your gap simply because you run faster than him without having... You may want to sprint here and burn just a little bit of stamina, but not too much. Now, you'll notice that you might take a little damage, but because you have 75% mitigation and the passive healing, and the healing that's going on because you are peppering your target with the restoration staff, you're probably going to be near full health once you've reestablished your gap. Now, as I said before, though, your Poison Mist mitigation will run out right about the time of his invulnerability runs out, and you simply reapply the stun to the target. He is either going to have to click out, which will virtually guarantee he has no stamina left, or he's going to have to eat the stun, which is going to allow you to get to optimal range, pound on him with your restoration staff, and refresh your dots. And this is very simply a rinse and repeat process, making sure that you always keep your stamina up so that you never have to eat his full melee damage. Once you've got him weakened, we move on to Impale. Let's say you can get him to eat a stun, which eventually he's going to have to do. You will then use Impale, which is both instacast, efficient, and cheap, and does massive amounts of damage on low health targets. So if you time it right, your target shouldn't be able to come out of that stun because Impale will be in the kill zone for Impale, and the fight is over. Now, I've made a few things sound a little bit easier than they are. Outlast builds like this have a huge learning curve. One of the biggest ones is going to be resource management. Poison Mist is not cheap. And if you spam cast it, you will be the one out of resources. Okay? You have to learn when to take a little bit of damage so that a resource is there when you don't have to take a lot of damage. Also, these two dots are reapplied every 8 and 12 seconds, respectively. Reapplying them early is an unnecessary consumption of magicka, and it is something that is very common. Once you've got that down, though, if you do still get in trouble, by the way, this is why Ice Comet is here. This is more of an oh shit button. It knocks the target back, applies a snare, but it has no magicka cost. So if you are running low, you can get this and reestablish your gap. Now that sounds all well and good, as long as your opponent is a melee DPS. But what if he's a fellow caster? Well, understand how most caster builds work. They use their magicka pool for damage, not their staffs. They heal by either switching out of their DPS bar to a restoration staff, where they can throw some very expensive heals and they are putting out almost no damage while doing so. Or on their DPS staff, if they do have a heal capability, it's based on AoE crit. Well, the AoE crit's a non-starter because there's only one. We're talking about a one-on-one situation right now. If you can force him into switching over to his restoration staff, he's going to have very little damage output. So really this comes down to how effectively he can manage his magicka pool versus how effectively you can. And how we do this is very simple. Now, we're going to apply many of the same principles as we do versus melee DPS. but we're going to close gaps. We're going to get into his face. So we get our run speed, our crippling grasp, which allows us to run faster than him, and our heal over time dot, slowly siphoning health. Now, any Outlast build, oftentimes you are going to start out from behind. The opponent is going to get a little bit lead. You have to have the fortitude to allow that to happen, understanding it's a marathon, not a sprint. He may get out to a little bit of a lead, but as long as you have your resources available to where he can't get in the kill zone, it's not a problem, because the tide will turn, because we are going to be using Magicka so much more efficiently than he is. So we've got our dots going. We get in his face, and now we are going to pop our Poison Mist, which allows us to mitigate 75% of his damage. Remember, he's using his Magicka pool to pump out the damage. I'm using mine to mitigate it. Whilst doing that, though, between my dots and my staff, I'm still operating at full capacity as far as damage output. He, on the other hand, is a lot of the time seeing a huge chunk of that damage being completely mitigated. Now, if he stays in melee range, he is going to eat the third dot from Poison Mist. Casters are pre-programmed to run, even though in this particular instance, it's probably not in his best interest to burn stamina to get out of your face. Now, he can burn Magicka to knock you back and do all that good stuff. Again, we're taking him out of his DPS cycle for no reason. So that's to our benefit. You just run right back in his face. It's not stopping you from pumping out any damage, right? So if he runs away or burns stamina to get away from you, he's susceptible to the stun mechanic, which you're going to want to throw out anyway just to keep him off balance. If he stands in your face, he's going to eat that third dot, and we are constantly going to be mitigating his damage as much as possible. He will begin to lose the race. His Magicka pool will start to disappear, and keep in mind we always have our oh shit button just to knock him down. The snare obviously isn't there, but it operates as an effective interrupt. And it's just the same thing over. Once he gets in the kill zone, we don't even necessarily have to stun him because he's a caster. He's probably not going to have those kind of defensives. We can move into the Impale and finish the fight. So really, it's just about managing your Magicka pool versus his. Let him burn his resources, and he will have no defense. One last thing about the 1v1 encounters is, as I mentioned, this build has a bit of a learning curve, so don't get discouraged early. Secondly, this game is balanced around large combat PvP, not 1 versus 1 encounters. So there are going to be people who basically, just because of the design of their build, have an inherent advantage over you. And those encounters are always going to be tough no matter what build you're running, because there's always somebody out there that has what we call a hard counter to that build. In fact, this build is so unusual that people probably won't necessarily understand exactly how to beat it, so it may allow you the greatest spectrum of killable opponents out there, as far because so many people are just going to revert to very predictable tactics, because they're simply not going to know what to do against a build like this. But don't get discouraged if you get beat up early. Like I said, there is a learning curve, and the game is not balanced. Speaking of large group PvP, let's now move on to our AoE bar. In comparison, the AoE bar is much simpler than the single target bar, and that's good because most combat in Cyrodiil is group-based anyway. We will be using the Destruction Staff for bar 2, so we will benefit from the Destruction Staff passives. Now, basically, this is just a shit all over everything like most AoE builds are. You're going to stack as many AoE build abilities on top of each other, starting with Elemental Blockade. This kind of establishes where you want to be working. Put that right over the enemy combatants. Going into Refreshing Path, which adds a movement buff and a small passive heal. The movement buff can be kind of handy because we are also with Elemental Ring probably going to be putting a snare. So if you do have some melee in your face and you can move around a little bit, you're going to want to stay in your area of effect. You follow the Elemental Ring with Swallow Soul, which should be a rather substantial heal. like mini caster AoE builds, as long as you have Magicka, you should be able to self-heal just through the passive heals and your damage output. Now, because there's really no use for stamina in this situation, we're going to go ahead and spec into Annulment, which is from your light armor. This is going to provide a damage shield, and it is stamina based. So once you get a little bit low on Magicka and you can't cast another Swallow Soul, maybe move into the damage shield. And finally, a similar situation with Devouring Swarm. Again, this is a passive heal and a nice little chunk of damage. You can use this either defensively as a heal or offensively. But basically, as you can see, this is just to stack up the passive damage, shit all over everything, standard AoE build with the Destruction Staff passives. And that about wraps her up. You will find a link to this build in the description section. Questions and concerns you can post in the comment section below the video. Also, bottom right hand corner is my Twitter address, @Dracobor. I do try and respond to everybody in both feeds. If you want to see more builds, hit that subscribe button because I do a new build every week.